Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us. Everyone on phone, can you hear us? Can anyone respond?
Yeah, we could hear you.
Thank you. So I'm giving the stage to Jason now.
What a spectacular introduction. So,
A man who needs no introduction.
that's right. Maybe nobody wants to introduce us. Because I see some people here who I don't necessarily know, let me just introduce myself really quickly. My name is Jason Kittredge. I'm basically the Principal Program Manager of Sustained Engineering, I believe is my current title, which is really long. I've actually been here for about 8 years, and today basically I'm going to give a presentation about story pointing and relative sizing. I've worked with a number of teams over the past few years as we've kind of adapted Agile, and I'll say that there seems to be some misconceptions about what story pointing is, what it can do, different approaches to it, things that people don't necessarily understand or think of. And so I thought I would just kind of put together a quick presentation for those who are interested. Thank you for coming. About what sizing is, how it can help us, what the benefits are, what things it can't do, and kind of talk a little bit about different methodologies that people use for it. So the first thing I want to talk about is sizing versus time estimates and what the differences are. Okay, so sizing is really determining how big an item is. Okay, it's a little bit different from a time estimate, which is how long is it going to take me to do something, when is it going to get done. Typically speaking, from a planning perspective, from a customer need perspective, everyone really wants to get to the when am I going to get this in my hand, when am I going to be able to deliver to the customer. But that's not what sizing is actually going to do for you. What sizing is going to do is it's going to determine how big is one item compared to other items that this team has done in the past. And because everybody needs analogies, this isn't going to be any use for anybody on the phone, you could say, this is a small item, this is a medium item, and this is a large item. Right? And you can basically kind of gear for that. Now, if you see something that's a little bit different from those things, but you know how big those are, you know that your team has estimated this at, let's say, 2 story points, and this is 8 story points, and this is 20 story points, you can look at this and say, this is about an 8 story point item. Maybe it's a little bit bigger, maybe it's a little bit smaller. It's not an exact match, but you have a rough idea of how big it is. And you can take other things, like this, and say, well, this is really, really big. So let's wait over here. But now, if you took something like my Bubba peg, you could say, which of these is it closer to? If you set gauges according to the level of effort for what this is, you basically set up a metric for yourself. So anytime something comes in, the team has the ability to analyze it fairly quickly and say, which of these things is it most like? Which category does it fall in? Now, this is an important distinction to make because we're basically measuring by analogy. The goal is to keep the level of effort to determine this sizing estimate to a minimum. So you don't need to know all of the details about everything that's going to happen. You just need to know roughly what it is, and that basically is good enough for long-term planning. It's not going to get you to the discrete things. It's not going to get you to the, I've looked at this, I've done my magic calculation so I know how many story points it is, therefore I'm going to deliver it on July 15th. That's not going to get you there. So our brains are not good at absolute sizing. We tend to forget details. We tend to munch things together. Anyone who's done any sort of cognitive science analysis understands the human brain is not good at looking at something and knowing exactly what it is. But we are excellent at doing comparison. We are very good at looking at two things and determining what their relationships are. So the whole point of sizing is to establish things that we can basically compare against to figure out what other things look like. And we'll get into a little bit more details about that. The other thing to note, and this is one of the reasons why it's different for sizing rather than time estimation, the size of an item is not influenced by external factors, okay? If we basically say something is X units large, it doesn't matter if our rate that we go through is, 1 unit a day or 1 unit a week. The size, the relative size is going to stay constant. If we have other external factors, let's say we get rid of other stories, or we get additional resources, or your manager commits you to work, an extra 8 hours over the course of the weekend. Those are things that affect the time, but it doesn't affect what your estimate for the size was. So what this allows us to do is abstract the sizing of anything, whether they be stories or tasks or bugs, and basically abstract them away from the amount of time it's going to take to actually consume it or deal with it. And that's an important thing to know, because a lot of people, when they look at these estimates and these progressions, they think that the size basically takes all of that into account, but it does not. All it's designed to do is to arbitrarily measure how much effort is X compared to Y. We can talk about the different philosophies around what should be included in story point estimates, but basically total effort is really what you're trying to account for. So people may raise their effort estimates based off of uncertainty, things they don't understand. They may want to build in a bit of a fudge factor. That happens. That's certainly part of it. There might be risk. We think we can do this pretty quickly, but it depends on this working. And then you find out that your external API doesn't support a specific call, or there are certain things that you basically made assumptions about which are no longer true, and that might blow your initial estimates out of the water. So there's risk involved as well. And all of these factors, the team should, as a collectively, take into account when they're trying to determine what the size is. So again, sizing is not directly analogous to time. Almost anybody who looks at story point estimates, the first thing they ask for is, oh, okay, and how many hours is that per story point? That's a far too simplistic view of the way the world works. Story points, while they do generally correlate with time, the bigger your story points are, the more time you tend to take with all other factors being considered. These are just estimates, and there really is no direct mapping, because part of it is your uncertainty. You don't know if this is going to work or not. Part of it is your risk, all of these different things that we talked about that basically can affect what the overall delivery scope is or when you're able to deliver it. So there's no real good way to directly map story points to time. A lot of people try to do that because that's what fits into the hole, but you can't really take a square peg and stick it to a round hole without taking having some other problems. So that's basically what sizing is. So time estimates, generally speaking, if you're delivering a small item, something that's very reasonable to accomplish, the human mind is pretty good at estimating it. And part of it is because if it's a small item, it usually involves doing things that you've done before. So your team or yourself, you have experience as to what you're looking at, so your estimates are more reliable. But the larger an item gets, the worse we get as humans at being able to accurately estimate. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. Part of it is the larger something is, the more complex it is, the greater the chance there's something you didn't anticipate that comes into it. So that's one factor. Another factor is the larger something is, the greater the chance that while the team's working on it, something else happens that detracts from the team. Now, I'm working with sustaining engineering right now. That's one of our big problems, is that anytime we have something that's large in estimate, we're generally pretty good at sizing, but the estimations are hard because if a customer suddenly has an emergency hotfix or priorities change, we suddenly have to stop whatever we're working on so we can address that, depending on capacity and all of that. But the chances of that happening grow dramatically as the size of whatever it is that we're tackling. So that's one of the reasons in Agile they always encourage you to break your stories down into as small an increment as possible, because it basically allows you to get better at some of the time estimates, but it also prevents interference from other things. You can basically bring something to completion without interference. So estimates, again, they're more accurate when you're talking about hours or a couple of days. They get really bad once you start talking about weeks and months. There's also a trade-off between specificity and accuracy. So a lot of times you'll hear, well, we want to make sure our estimates are 100% accurate. If you give me a story, a fairly small story, I can tell you that's going to take between 1 minute and 3 years, and I'll probably be accurate all the time. It's not useful to you at all. You can't do any planning based off of that, but I've maintained my accuracy. Now, the more specific you get, the less the chances of me hitting the target. Oh, I've seen this story. That's going to take me 3 work days, 4 hours, 27 minutes, and 16 seconds. Okay? That's a very specific number. Am I going to be able to hit that? Probably not. So my accuracy goes down based on specificity. So what you want is you want a balance between the two. Time estimates aren't really good for that. We'll talk a little bit about how story points can kind of help that and kind of get you into that happy balance. But it's really different from basically making a time estimate. And another thing I want to point out, because this has a tendency to burn people, is there's always a difference between making an estimate and making a commitment. One of the problems with time estimates is that you're using the same units of time, right? You're basically estimating, I will get that done by next Friday. What does your manager hear? Or what does other people, what does the customer hear? Oh, I'm going to have that on Friday. I didn't make the commitment to have it done on Friday. I made the estimate that that's what it would take. That estimate is useful for planning purposes. But I also have not made a commitment. A commitment implies that if I'm off target, people are going to be working extra hours, people are going to be doing extra things to make that happen. And sometimes teams need to make commitments. I'm not saying that there's no need for commitment. I'm saying that is a distinction between making a commitment and making an estimate. One of the problems with time estimates is it is very easy to misinterpret a time estimate as a commitment. And that's something that you can avoid with story points. Because if somebody asks me, well, what's it going to take? And I say, oh, that's about 8 story points. That's not something you can easily translate to, that means I'll get it next Friday, right? Now, it may be that through further discussion, yeah, so generally, based on our team's philosophy, what we're working on, what's on the plate, it's 8 story points. We think it'll probably be done next Friday. But it's very clear that we think that's what's going to be done. I'm committing to saying we've sized this to 8. I'm not committing to next Friday. So that's an important distinction to make. And one of the reasons why Agile favors a sizing type of mechanism over a time estimation. All right, so that's what we're talking about. So what we're talking about right now with story pointing is sizing, not time estimates. There are things we can do to get to time estimates, and we can talk about that. So what is sizing good for? So we talked a little bit about velocity. So I actually, with the sustaining engineering team, we actually went through this really interesting exercise a few weeks ago where we took all of the stories in bugs, because we deal a lot with bugs, that we delivered over the last 4 months, and we used an exercise, which I'll show you guys later, around an estimation board to basically size everything that we've done over the past 4 to 5 months. From there, I broke down to say, how many story points did we deliver in 1 month increments? And that kind of established, for our team, the way we are now, we can deliver this amount of story points on average in a month. Now, that means, as we're estimating things for the future, if we're doing the same sizing estimate, we get a sense of about how much can we deliver next month. It's not a commitment. We can be wrong with our estimates. We might think something is a small when it's really a large. We might also go the other way. We don't have the exact pieces to say, oh, we can get exactly this fit in, but we have a pretty good sense of it. And the way that we're basically going to deliver on time box estimates, something that has a deadline, we're going to say, here's the prioritized order with which we're working things, and this is what our level of confidence is with each thing. And as you go down that list, our level of confidence should drop because there might be other factors that are higher up in the list. Doesn't mean we're not going to be able to accomplish it. we might be able to get through everything. But our level of confidence, which does get modified as we're kind of moving forward, we get a sense of what we think we can deliver without making a commitment. And then what that means is from a planning point of view, we get a sense as to how much we're going to burn down what's on our backlog over the course of the month. What we'll do is we'll progressively monitor our velocity. Are we going slower than we're expecting? We'll look for factors as to why. Why are we going slower? There were people on vacation. Were people pulled off to work on other teams? I didn't know that was on. So there are a number of factors that basically influence what actually happens there. But ultimately, as a predictive tool, we get a sense of what we can reasonably accomplish over the course of the month. And that's an important thing for planning. So that's establishing velocity. It also, these exercises make it easy to identify when something is too big for the team to work on. Because if we basically say, we're going to commit only to things that we can accomplish over the course of 2 weeks, and we know on average, let's say that means that we can do 16 points, 2 8-point stories over the course of 2 weeks or whatever. If something comes in and we say it's a 40-point story, we know right away that is too big for the level that we work at. That needs to be broken down into smaller pieces, or somebody else who's not us needs to make commitment to that. So without having to go into all of the nuances and details, spending hours or days figuring out that it's too big, we just kind of look at it, get a sense of what it is, and that allows us to make an initial decision or determination as to how we should approach that particular item. Another thing about sizing is we get a chance to do a lot of things in our backlog. So the team has an opportunity to know what's coming. Things aren't going to catch them by surprise, because typically what you're going to do is you're going to size at least a sprint or two in advance, so everyone knows what to expect as things are coming. It's not going to get you to the point where you have your detailed estimates. You don't necessarily know what your test plans are. You're not going to do all that fine breakdown. But it's not going to come as a shock when this story appears in your sprint backlog, right? It's also an opportunity to have high-level discussions on features, but this is usually fairly limited. Depending on the mechanism that you use for sizing exercises, you may spend anywhere from 10 to 15 seconds to 10 to 15 minutes talking about a specific story. Generally, the smaller things you usually spend less time on, because that's generally well understood. It's usually the things that are most confusing that you spend more time on. And again, the way that you're going to do the sizing probably varies according to your goal. How many people here are familiar with planning poker? Have done planning poker with the relative size? Okay. So planning poker is a case where the product manager presents a story or a feature or whatever. There's some free discussion. People ask questions. At some point, whoever's facilitating the meeting says, how big is this? All of the participants have cards with numbers on them. They hold up the card. If everyone's in agreement, then you just mark that and you move on to the next story. The real discussions happen when you do that and people are in complete disagreement. Someone called it a 2 and someone called it a 20. Why? There's a reason for that. The person who called it a 2 thinks it's small, and there's a reason they think it's small. And the person who called it a 20 thinks it's a 20. So when you have those sorts of differences, that's an opportunity for the team to identify, here's something we really need more information on. We need to dig into this deeper, understand who's right, the 2 or the 20 or somewhere in between, and figure that out. Now, doing that sort of an exercise, in an hour, I would say on average, most of the good teams that I've worked with could probably get through maybe 10 to 12 stories tops. A lot of teams that I've worked with, we would be lucky if we could get through 2 to 3 because, details would come up. We'd want to get into the weeds. And if you have a huge backlog, that's not going to work for you. So we'll talk about that and some other mechanisms to deal with large numbers of story points. So getting a general sense of what the team can deliver, that's really around the velocity, which we already talked about, and helping to plan and prioritize. We frequently talk about priorities in terms of what order we're going to address things in terms of the business needs. This is more important than that. That is more important than this other thing. Therefore, that's the order that we're going to deal with. But the real way to do that sort of planning should actually be based on something called return on investment. What is the business value of what you're delivering versus the level of effort it's going to take to deliver? So if you have two things that are equally important, and one only requires a couple of days worth of work and another thing requires a couple of months worth of work, you're always going to deliver the one that's smaller because you're going to basically meet a business need, satisfy the maximum number of people with the least amount of effort. So that's basically how you're going to tend to go. When you're doing prioritized planning with backlog, this is an important thing to know. What is the relative business importance of this item compared to everything else? And that's something that gets ranked by services, people who represent the customer, that sort of thing. So then you need to take the level of effort, and you need a way to measure that level of effort. And StoryPoints is a way to do that. So if you had, let's say, some sort of a value metric, right? So like on a scale of 1 to 100, how important is this versus that, you could take this list and prioritize it. You take those items, you have the team estimated with sizing. And you basically can do a very simple arithmetic equation. You take the value, divide it by the level of effort, come up with a ratio. And if you order things based off of that ratio, you know that you're always working in the order of greatest return on investment. So this is a valuable tool for that because something like StoryPoint gives you a tool by which you can determine the relative estimate and basically use that for priority purposes. So in that sense, StoryPoints are important for that. So let's talk about what sizing is not good for. Not good for creating commitment. As I said, you'll find one of the key elements of almost all of the StoryPoint mechanisms that are out there is they actually use a nonlinear progression in order to determine how big something is. With the possible exception of T-shirt sizes, but that's a whole different thing. But any numeric-based one, which will be Fibonacci sequence, modified Fibonacci sequence, binary sequence, you basically take an item and you say, how many story points relative to this scale is it? But you can only assign one of the numbers that's on the scale. So typically the teams that I work with use a modified Fibonacci sequence. So something is either 0, a half, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, then it goes to 20, 40, 100. Any given story, you have to give one of those numbers to. Note, there's nothing like, an 11, right? 11, which is between an 8 and a 13. The team has to decide it's an 8 or it's a 13. And one of the reasons why you do that is because these are estimates. It forces there to be a sense of not being sure, right? You have a number that you've picked, but you don't know if it's a little bit more than that or a little bit less than that, but the team doesn't have the option to tweak it. That's just what it is. So for planning purposes, given that there's uncertainty in the estimation anyway, the system actually builds that uncertainty in. So that's an important thing to know. Because of that, you can't realistically come up with commitments based on that. Your whole sizing premise has uncertainty built in, and a commitment is based on certainty. So you basically need the team to commit to something for a deliverable. And that comes as part of the sprint planning process, or when you do a further breakdown of estimates, which goes back to the time estimation that we're talking about there. Sizing is also generally based on high-level review of what it is that you're doing. Don't get into detailed analysis of how the work gets broken down. This, again, was one of the traps that I was talking about with some of the teams I worked with before, where in an hour we could only get through 2 or 3 stories. It's because they were getting bogged down into a detailed analysis of how everything is going to work. There are valid questions to be asked. Sizing is not going to get you to the point where you're fully planned and you're ready to go and everything's done and you're ready to start. There's still additional planning that has to happen to it. But what sizing is going to get you is how big is this, where should it go on my priority list, when should we deal with it? That's what that's going to help you with. And again, getting into details on stories is all related to that. I think we talked about this. You don't want to spend too much time breaking down a story. You don't want to get overly concerned about accuracy. You just need to be good enough so that you know you're planning the right way. You shouldn't let outside factors influence team decisions. And one of the key things around that is I've seen teams who basically have their own story point scale in mind, right? So they know how big a 3 is for them. And they see other teams where the same sort of story might be different. And they kind of want to say, well, we should be like them because they're a good team and they know what's going on. But that's not what it is. A story point estimate is very specific to the team, specific to the team's structure, who's in there, how much QA do you have versus dev, what kind of dev expertise do you have, what kind of QA expertise do you have. There's so many factors that make each team unique, it really would be ridiculous to try to take one team's estimate and impose it on another. And for that reason, it's very difficult to get to a point where you have a constant story point scale that applies to all the teams. There are organizations that have tried this. Every story I've heard about it has ended in pure disaster. This is really about the team. What does the team think it is, and what is the team's philosophy? If a story moves from one team to another, those estimates need to be thrown out. That sizing needs to be thrown out. It needs to be redone by the team who's taking responsibility for it. That's a really important factor to know. And one other thing that I find has happened in the past is taking the sizing story point estimate and thinking that it delivers more information than it actually does. Okay? The point of the sizing, the point of the story pointing, is to give a general sense of how big is this compared to other things that I have done. Okay? It is not about this is going to be done on this date. It is not basically saying, oh, because this is smaller, it's going to be easier. It's basically just a relative sense of what the team feels it is compared to past things that they've done. And sometimes it's easy for people to try to infer more data than is actually presented by the team. So let's talk a little bit about story point. It is a measure of effort based on multiple factors. So effort, complexity, and certainty. Let's see if I can scale that a bit. So this is the traditional, this is what a story point is. There are different philosophies on that. Some people think complexity should have nothing to do with story point. Others think uncertainty shouldn't be there. It should be purely on effort. What's important from the measuring point of view, because each team has their own standard, is that the team is internally consistent with what factors they consider when they're basically making story point estimates. Because overall, when you're dealing with this from a planning perspective, your velocity is going to be determined by whatever the story points were determined by the team. So the team can have their own standard as to what a story point is. The whole system is designed for that because everything's based off of the team and the team's data. So that's an important thing to note. But generally speaking, a story point is a unit that measures the level of effort that the team needs to go through. And as I mentioned, all of the popular systems for sizing, which we'll go over in a minute, basically include some sort of nonlinear progression which takes into account the uncertainty factor. So I'll just go through the presentation, then we can have a discussion and see what kind of questions there are. So there are different sizing systems. These are the most common. The first one is t-shirt sizing, where you basically just say, okay, if this were a t-shirt, how big would it be? Now, typically speaking, what happens from a planning perspective is someone has to convert these sizes and put them into their heuristics so they can figure out, okay, what does that mean? So generally speaking, the team will pick extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. But anytime any analytics need to be done with this data, someone is converting these to numbers on the back end. Someone's either saying, oh, on a Fibonacci sequence, this is a 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, or they're doing something along those lines. So that's t-shirt sizing. The next is a pure Fibonacci sequence, and I don't know, how into math you guys get, but Fibonacci sequence has some great things around spirals and mathematical properties, and we won't get into all of that. But basically, in the Fibonacci sequence, every number is basically the two numbers before. So, 1 goes to 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 13, etc. And you end up with this nice spiral. So that is a pure Fibonacci sequence. What's interesting about that is that as you progress higher, your numbers actually get further and further apart. And what that actually represents analogously is the level of uncertainty, because as you have larger items, you have more uncertainty. That's kind of where the math is kind of pretty on them. every planning poker set of cards that I've seen uses a modified Fibonacci sequence, which basically looks like this. So you end up with this sequence of numbers, 0, a half, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. Then apparently, if you don't have round numbers, when you get higher, it confuses people, so they go to 20, 40, 100. Almost every piece of software that I've seen around story points uses these sequences. Again, it's the same sort of thing. There's a nonlinear progression. There's uncertainty built in. And I find it's usually easiest to do this with teams because all of the tools out there basically are geared for that. And some people, not a lot, but they'll actually do base 2 sequences so that your story points are either 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128 type thing. Again, it's the same idea, which is basically you have a nonlinear progression to represent uncertainty. No matter which system you determine, as long as it's consistent for the team, it's a reasonable thing to do in terms of planning and estimating. Typically, like I said, it's easier for teams to use this modified Fibonacci sequence because that's what all the tools are basically for, and that's every team that I've worked with here does that. But there are variants out there, and I just want to kind of explain and how they work. And then you have different techniques around how to use these sizes. So the first one that we talked about really was planning poker, which we kind of walked through. This is somebody presents the story, there's a discussion, the team votes. The important piece about the voting is that everyone's estimates are hidden and they're all revealed at once because you don't want one person's opinion to influence the others until the discussion has taken place. You want to get everybody's gut feel to reveal if there are any misunderstandings. After that, what you want to do is achieve consensus. A lot of people, when they initially hear about planning poker, think they can just take an average of everyone's estimate and use that. That's not a healthy thing to do. The purpose of this is to promote discussion so the team reaches consensus on how large an item is. That's what the purpose of planning poker is. So again, this is actually a very useful tool. One of the key problems is that it's not very scalable. If you have hundreds and hundreds of stories in your backlog, it's going to take a long time to get through them all. And so the level of effort that you're expending versus what you're getting in return becomes disproportionate. So that's usually good for if you're dealing with a handful of stories for the team that you need to estimate. But if you're going to do something larger, I actually prefer an estimation board. So the idea here is you basically have almost like a Kanban board, but the columns actually represent sizes. So in the teams that I've done this with, we basically use the modified Fibonacci sequence where you'll use 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, blah, blah, blah. And then what I actually do is I print out cards of all the stories, and we did this with what? It was like 400 that did that. So I'll take 400 stories. We'll have like 8 people there. I'll give them all 25 apiece, and they basically put them in the column that they think that it belongs in. It's interesting because this is a silent exercise. Nobody's allowed to talk at this point. They just put it where they think they is, where they go. They have like a 10-minute time limit, and they put everything down. Then round 2, what we do is, again, silently, everyone reviews where the stories are. And if they disagree where something was placed, they move it. If they move it, they set it aside so that people know that it was moved because it might get moved back. Then round 3, they do the same thing, but this time they discuss it. And if there's something that has uncertainty, it leads to a discussion. The team reaches consensus, and we basically assign it to that size. So doing this is actually very scalable. We've done this on 2 occasions with the sustaining engineering team. I believe over the course of those 2 hours, each one was like an hour, and we probably scaled somewhere in the order of 700 to 800 stories, which is really great and has been useful. Now, again, when you're taking a thing and you're putting it there, that's not going to get you a lot of detail, right? It's not going to get you to the point where you can plan or predict or any of that. But it does get us to the point where we have a useful size metric by which we can use for, the size, figuring out the relative priorities based off of, the business value versus the size. It does give us much more to do and understand in terms of planning. You know, our velocity is based off of a lot of these sorts of numbers. So we have a reasonable sense of what we can deliver. And that basically gives us a lot of value. So other things you can do, analogous estimating. This is actually something, you know, very common and actually part of almost what you do inherently with this sizing. Is you take an item and you say, okay, I did a story that was very similar to this. It wasn't quite the same, but it was very similar. Therefore, my size and estimate will be the same as whatever that was. Okay. That's kind of inherent to what we're doing here, but a lot of people just purely do that, and they do that with time estimates, and that gets kind of messy. And then, of course, there is the pure guesswork, where you just really have no idea, so you just pick it. So I hope I haven't bored you all completely to death, but that's really what I kind of plan on talking about, and I'd like to see if anybody has any questions or wants to start a discussion on anything around that. Yes, Claude.
So you were talking about the business value, return on investment.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that we currently do not track that.
So I can't.
Not on the ticket, certainly.
Yeah. Well, my world right now is sustaining engineering, and we definitely do that because our backlog is in a force rent prioritized way, right? So
you do the business value based on force rent order,
yeah,
as opposed to business value is size.
correct. And I have proposals to do what you're speaking about, right? So one thing I did a very interesting exercise probably 6 years ago here when I was working for the product management group, where, and this is how I think life should work, but you know, that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but I'll go over it anyway. Where we basically took all of our stories, we spread them out on a table. Okay. I gave each product manager fake money. I gave them like $1,500 worth of money and like $10 bills worth of money. And I basically asked them all to put how much money they would pay, given that they have limited resources, on each of the stories in their relative order of importance, right? So they all did that, and afterward, I basically counted up how much money each story got, and that became the relative business value of each of those stories. So again, it was a fairly simple exercise, but when I took those numbers, right, the dollar value, fake dollar value of these stories, and then I took the estimate, now I could get to that ROI. So there are ways to do that. There are proposals about how to do that. Some people are resistant to that. They think that getting the business value for each individual item is too much effort. I personally disagree, but again, the world does not hinge on everything that I want. If anyone has the ability to make that happen, let them know. But yes, that's yeah.
So this is great. I mean, I think it helps us understand better how, you know, how the development team figures this out, things like that. But it's really hard to give that message to clients, to your client services, and your client facing. So I think we're always asking for when, because that's what the customers are really pushing on us. And then the other thing about the return on investment is the return on investment.
So that basically depends on how we capture the metric. So in my view, the return on investment is actually a joint effort, but business priority half of it should come from someone who is a customer representative, whether that be the services group, product management on behalf of customer needs and future customers and the product or whatever, but someone from a customer-facing value is the one who determines this is what's more important than that. The level of effort, because engineers, pure engineers, that should be black box to them. We said this is important, therefore it's important. On the other half, the engineers, the people who are actually doing the work, you know, that includes QA, development, all of those, they basically need to say, okay, what's it going to take for us to deliver that? So if you take all of the value, which comes from the customer side, and divide it by all of the effort, which comes from the engineering side, that's how you arrive at your overall ROI. So if a customer makes something very valuable, their ROI is going to tend to go up. If the engineers say, well, that's a lot of effort, it will tend to go down. And the balance of it is what you end up with in that ROI.
And what would you suggest? I know I've worked with Sigma before, where someone, hey, that's an extra large t-shirt size. And I mean, for the first time as a businessman, I heard that, I was thinking, how do you really relate that? So they have no idea what they're going to be wearing that extra large.
Absolutely, absolutely. So my opinion is that I will say, personally, I hate t-shirt sizes. And the reason I hate t-shirt sizes is because you can't do anything. Like, it's easier for people to say, oh, now that I've said it's the t-shirt size, yeah, this is what, like, that makes that piece of it easy. But you still have to do some sort of a transformation in order to make it actionable or workable. That's why I prefer something like a modified Fibonacci sequence, because you can basically use that in heuristics and algorithms to kind of figure out what things mean. Even with that, you're not going to get to the answer the customer wants, which is, when am I going to get it, right? So there are a couple of different approaches. So in Agile development, we generally have deliverables categorized into two categories. Is a time box deliverable, or is a feature box deliverable? And those are words I throw around all the time. I argue with people about them all the time. A time box deliverable says, on this date, we're going to deliver you something. Not going to tell you what it is. I don't know what it is. I think it's going to be this. Might or might not fit, and based on here's what your priorities are, here's what our ROI metrics say, we're working on this and this and this and this, we're going to get as far down the list as we can, and that's what we're going to deliver because you need to have it on this date. That's one way of delivering. Now, what that means is that a customer or anyone else has the ability to predict when they're going to get something. What they lose is the ability of knowing exactly what it is. They get some sense of it. We'll give them the sense of this is what our prioritization is. We think this is going to go in, but we're not promising it. On the other hand, you have feature box, which basically says this deliverable has to have A, B, and C in it. I can't accept it if it doesn't have all three of those things. There's no point in giving it to me unless those three things are in. So in that case, you can say, we promise we're going to deliver A, B, and C, but I can't tell you when you're going to get it. I can estimate when I think it's going to be there based off of these techniques of saying, okay, the sizing for this is that's an 8-point story, 8-point story, 5-point story. We're going to have some additional effort because of building and packaging. So overall, that's going to be 28 story points total. I know that our general velocity says if we're focused on that, we can deliver 28 story points in about 3 weeks. We think we can get it to you in about 3 weeks. So on our board, like sustaining engineering, and again, this generalizes to all of engineering, but it works on a much different scale. I can say we're going to have 614 or 615. It's going to be delivered on 630, and here's what I think is going to be in it. Or I can say I'm going to deliver 615, which is going to have CP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, CP 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, CP 9, 10, 11, whatever. And that's definitely going to be in there. I think it's going to be around the end of July, but I don't know. And I'll generally try to give a level of confidence to give you guidance as to what you can tell the customer and what you think, but again, not to overcommit, because missing a commitment is something we don't ever commit.
So you mentioned that you prefer Fibonacci.
Fibonacci, yeah.
Fibonacci.
Modified Fibonacci is actually my preference. Yep.
If you have a customer that's asking you to do t-shirt sizing, and you say to them, well, I really think you should do Fibonacci something. If you're delivering a solution that's going to integrate with other solutions they're also bringing in, can you do it this way if they're using t-shirt sizing?
You can. It's a little tricky. No, I'm sorry. So the question here, and I'm going to, correct me if I get this wrong. If you're dealing with an external entity like a customer, and let's say you're doing a project that involves multiple organizations working together, and you're using slightly different flavors of Agile, where you're doing your estimation with Fibonacci sequence, they're doing their estimations based on t-shirt sizing, and let's say someone else is doing binary. How are you able to integrate these systems? That's the crux of the system. The question.
Clarification.
Yes.
Even if the two different teams
And that's about what I'm about to say. Very good at class. The issue is all of the estimates are based on the specifics of the team that are doing the work, right? So our estimates from TrueCare and, the estimates from Acme X, if I say it's 8 story points and they say it's 8 story points, 8 story points for us could be 3 weeks worth of work and could be 5 months of work for them. We don't know because the teams that are doing the work is relative to their system. So generally speaking, when you're doing these sorts of story point estimates, these sorts of sizing, it really should be confined to the specific team that's working. Now, if you have, a cross-development team, so let's say you have a team where the actual work is being shared across the 3 organizations, and you have different people who are working on the same thing, that team should basically determine what process they're going to use, and everyone for that team should be using the same process because they're functioning as a single unit. Any other questions? I think we're just about out of time. Right? Oh, yeah.
For the ROI, do you take into account if there's multiple clients out?
You should, yeah. So in the exercise that I explained before, where I had product managers do it, other variations of that would be, and honestly, I've wanted to do this before. I don't know how specifically. Take customer reps. So let's say we have reps for Centene and Cigna and CBC and WellMed and all this. Give them each X amount of dollars, and it doesn't have to be the same amount. You might say, well, Cigna and CBC, those are huge accounts. We need to put a lot of love toward them. And Martin's Point, maybe not so much, or whatever it is. But give out those dollars and say, okay, here are the features that are on the table. How important are they to you? Have each representative say, from my customer point of view, this is important, this is important, that is important. At the end, when you're trying to determine the relative value of those things, it's basically across the board. Now, there are other different mathematical ways of doing it. I actually, if you want, after this, I can show you some models that I've actually mocked up, where you basically have a really good way of doing this. The idea would be that in JIRA, for instance, for a given story, you have a mechanism by which you can take customers and associate their customer value to a ticket, use that in a more grand calculation. I can go over that with you. I may have gone over it with you before, I'm trying to remember. Those are kind of things that are in the background. There's some technical resourcing things that we have to get through this, but I'm trying to kind of pitch it to get to a point where we're doing that.
Does anyone on call have any question?
They all fell asleep or left. It's okay. All right. Is there anything else? Okay. Thank you for joining us, everyone.